Final talk on this session, and that will look at the supply, policy, and financing opportunities in this endeavor. So Dr. Jessica Rockwood will be talking on this.
Good afternoon, everyone. Ooh, sorry, that's really loud. Where's the... Oh, there it is, okay.
You have to see it, just put it down.
Yeah.
And then you got to push that.
Got it.
You need to speak there.
So, as mentioned, I am going to speak on the supply, the policy, and the financing options for what it would take to plan for success for ivermectin for malaria. And what I'm showing you here is, well, before I do that, I want to ask, who has taken a new or reprogrammed intervention for malaria to market? Has anyone in the room done that? There's one. Okay, so I'm going to give a quiz at the end of my talk for the rest of you to see how you guys will do. So what you've heard in the previous presentations is that we're defining the need and assessing the relevance for disease reduction. I don't think anyone in the public health space would state that this is not a step that needs to be taken moving forward. After that, you are really looking at undertaking policy recommendation and new intervention pathway within the World Health Organization pre-qualification structure. Then, of course, we know that much of the work to take a product to market includes trials and the beginning of country engagement. As we know very well, country engagement is key, and every country is very different when it comes to any kind of public health product. As I mentioned before, and I will probably state this again a number of times, it is absolutely important to assess what WHO pre-qualification compliance requirements will be needed. And at that point, you need to really understand and assess what kind of suppliers are interested. Are they on the PQ listing? Currently, they are not. And what kind of pricing you can get. And why are we even talking about pricing and procurement and financing? We are not talking about a Mectizan donation program here. We are definitely talking about bringing a product to market that must comply with market dynamics, with our donor procurement policies and WHO frameworks and requirements. So now I'm up to the orange step, and we're getting up towards the gold cup there, as you see. As I mentioned, we then will look at country and donor engagement, but with that requires the regulatory in-country piece, looking at the national strategic plans for malaria specifically, and procurement planning. And as I said, that goes back to really understanding what the capacity of a compliant supplier would be. And then, of course, we look at implementation and scale, which, as we all know, will include monitoring and evaluation and surveillance. And then at the bottom, you see there that we're estimating that to be 6+ years. So this is not a quick process in any case, but also we know because it's public health, we have to really be very strict with certain things. Now, I just want to tease out a little bit what happens after a WHO MPAC or VCAG recommendation on the trials that will be being undertaken. So if you look at, and I could go on forever on these lists, But I'm going to keep it short because my time is limited. When you look at supply, it's important to really develop investment cases for and with industry. Assessing, as I said, WHO pre-Q qualification for potential suppliers. I think Gina mentioned in the beginning that there are 2 suppliers planned in about 2 years' time. And applications and inspection for PQ listing, allowing for donor financing. I think most of us who work in malaria or even NTDs know that this is a very important requirement. When we look at country engagement, this is very much a large part of bringing a product to market, of course. We need to look at the mapping of potential country beneficiaries aligned with best case scenarios for disease impact. And I'm going back to the One Health concept there, because in this case it's going to be medical, or it's going to be human and animal, we think. The engagement of NMCPs and key opinion leaders, including partnership forums. We really need the feedback. We need the engagement of people that are going to be impacted by the work that's being undertaken. Then, of course, not only do you have WHO and donor requirements, but you also have country-level regulatory requirements. Each country is different, some regions are different, and you really need the best understanding of how to proceed with that, and that needs to be mapped as well. And then, as I mentioned before, it's critical that if a country is interested in utilizing ivermectin or any other new drug or technology commodity, that it needs to be aligned with the National Strategic Plan. And then, of course, you need to look at financing, and that would be to include it in a gap analysis and donor funding requests. For financing and procurement, I'm not going to go on the first one. I've already talked about it enough. But you really also need to look at the financing and the engagement of the financing institutions on the perceived demand, which takes me to this slide. It looks really easy, but when you look at the world of malaria, we all know that the Global Fund accounts for about 50% of all procurement of HIV, TB, and malaria. And so with that, you have the first area on the left. You have the Global Fund, which has 3 different mechanisms for procurement depending on the country capacity, the status of a country, or any kind of other situation, considering, let's say, they're a complex operating environment. PMI also has 2 different procurement streams, as you'll see there. One is a procurement consortium, and another one is one specific for IRS. UNICEF has its own process. World Health Organization has its own process, and then of course we have the World Bank, who will go through procurement implementation units within the MOH, or they'll go through procurement agents or the UN agencies. That looks so easy, right? It is a very complicated process. So the remainder, as I said, of procurement will happen through PMI and the other institutions, and again, it depends upon the country. But just also to say that countries also finance procurements, and that with domestic resources increasing is happening in some contexts. So this is my last slide. This is really an overview to give you of what is being planned and how much energy this is going to take to move forward. If you look at the 2 first steps here, for defining the need and assessing the relevance for disease reduction and undertaking the new intervention pathway. We're looking for a 2-year period, 2018 through 2020. When we're looking at supply and we're looking at recommendations from WHO, you're looking at 2018 to 2022. And that includes, the country and donor engagement with all of those processes that I explained earlier. So that's another 4 years, and these are all estimates, by the way, so please don't hold me to it later. And then when we look at implementation and scale, of course, we're looking at 2023 and beyond. So that is the end of my overview. Test will be given later, but thank you to all my colleagues.
So thank you very much. Can we have the 3 other presenters join us? We still have about 15 minutes for a good discussion. Okay, so now we've had the whole picture, and if there are any quick questions for the last presentation, but now you can ask questions to the panel members across the 4 presentations. So the floor is open.
Thank you for the very interesting set of presentations. It's really been an amazing amount of work that's been done on this, and it shows the complexity of trying to do something that seems simple. One piece that I didn't hear discussed, which I think adds another level of complexity, is around the regulatory pathway. And I don't know if you don't want to discuss that today, but I'm just curious about, when it comes to indication and licensure and of the product, whether it be in human or animals, for its use against a vector. And so even in the animal health, this is going to be used not for the animal necessarily, but for a human. What are your thoughts on that piece and how to overcome that or address that?
Why don't you start with the animal based on our discussion?
Goodness. Tell them about your conversation.
Okay. So Gina, chime in if I get this wrong, because it is complex. You're absolutely right, and it's confusing. It's even confusing for the regulatory agencies, right? So we actually did have a conversation with the FDA, the Center for Veterinary Medicine within FDA. We went to a number of sources and finally ended up with them, and they, I think, were the most helpful. But the idea, ultimately what it comes down to is they're going to defer to human health as the starting point. But it is a challenge, and it's something that they said that if this actually moves through, that they were interested in addressing, because it really hasn't been done before. This idea that an indication, a labeled dose, especially if the dose ends up being different than what it's currently labeled for, which I don't even want to get into that. But even if you're using the labeled dose, but the indication is different, right? You're using it, and the indication ultimately, would you label it as a treatment to prevent or as a vector control, or is your indication the prevention of malaria in humans, right? It becomes very tricky. So I would say that there are no clear-cut answers, but I know that the idea is that it would start with the human component, and then the animal health professionals would work with them based on the evaluation from the human aspect. Does that sound right, Gina? Any other comments?
Yeah, I think for clarity, what's proposed right now and what will be potentially evaluated is the licensed dose in veterinary populations in Africa, with the understanding that massive amounts of ivermectin is used for herds in the north. And the degradation data, resistance data, et cetera, will be unique to Africa, with understanding that there's more environmental challenge to the drug remaining in the ground, but we need to document that, right? For human use, what we're proposing what the studies are proposing vary, And as Carlos showed, it was 300 times 3 versus 400. 400 times 1 is within the approved dose range in the EMA label. So it's not the label or the dose, and these are licensed drugs, but it is the indication that requires some thinking through. Mm-hmm. And there is a pathway for evaluation through the single entry portal in VCAG that gets you to present the data to the drug group, the vector control group, the WHO group, and the NTD group, potentially all at the same time. That should be quite fun. I mean that would be a great process to have, because then they're all listening to each other. I do mean that in a very positive way.
A question to Frank and Jessica. Frank made the point that the use of ivermectin with NTDs is primarily through donations. And Jessica made the point that if we're going to use this for malaria, this is going to have to be procured in a conventional sense. And I wondered whether you've been thinking through the possibility of the interactions between those two processes and the possibility of unintended consequences going in either direction, and whether you'd like to comment on that interaction.
You know, when I bumped into a reporter at the New York Times last night, and I said I was going to be speaking at this. Well, you should come here. And I said, are you speaking this? And he said, oh, I interviewed for you about that about several years ago, and you were like totally negative about it. And I said, well, yeah, I was totally negative about it until I realized that malaria was talking about buying the ivermectin, because I didn't think that the donation was going to be able to support the amount of ivermectin that people were talking about. So I think you bring up a very, very good point about unintended consequences regarding the donations and malaria's use of what would not be donated but procured, obviously, well, pre-qualified compound, and it would be, yeah, that would be an interesting thing to see get played out. Again, from my perspective, I think we're up against basically a limit, in my opinion, in terms of the ability of the donation to go much above 1.2 billion tablets a year, and I think that's already a challenge for the IDA, which could all be used up in India for the LF program. So I do think that having a new source of ivermectin that is not just relying on donors, in my mind, would be a good thing, even though it would be a challenge for the pharmacophilanthropy side of it. Thanks.
And if I could clarify, that has been a central assumption in our discussions and in talking to both NTD community, pharma, and biotech, that this would be a high volume, low price generics market. And that is really a central assumption of the presentation that Jessica made and of our discussions with both industry and with the NTD community thus far, as well as with the malaria community, which is used to figuring out how to pay for a drug. The good news is that it's a very low-cost drug in terms of cost of goods. So we'll have to figure out what that cost translates to in Africa.
Thank you for a very interesting discussion. I have one matter of clarification. I forget who talked about it, but you said you wanted to use this in the context of seasonal malaria chemotherapy. So with the drug, and I presume you're going to exclude children below the age of 5, right? Because it's not approved for children under the age of 5, even in this country for scabies, for example. Mm-hmm. So would you have to do PKA studies on whatever the seasonal so we're going to use it in combination with Coartem, for example, plus X dose of ivermectin, for example? So you would, I presume, since you're using the drug for a different reason than it's usually used for, and secondly, since you're using it with a drug that's given around the same time, that you have to do PKA studies and safety studies on that. Is that correct? Is that part of the plans?
Carlos, you can answer. Carlos.
So if I understand correctly, you're asking about
the combination of ivermectin with SMC and whether it could be given to children under 5 because of the label, and whether DDI studies are needed to assess whether there's potential interactions. Well, yes, and as I mentioned, there's more than one way to look at SMC with ivermectin. You can use ivermectin to be given to the children that are eligible. So there are children under 5 that are above 15 kilos that could be eligible, and in Frank's poll could be eligible to get the drug. And it's also an opportunity to do what Rick Stegedy called operational boosting, in which you use the contact point for SMC as an opportunity to distribute ivermectin to the household. That would also protect the children from the mosquitoes biting.
What you're talking about seasonal chemotherapy, you mean everybody gets the drugs, there's no point of care testing done to see who's going to get the drug. You give it to the community. Is that everybody the age of 5? Maybe I misunderstand what you're...
Yeah, that's what I'm talking about. If you can use the SMC as the structure to which you distribute ivermectin to the community.
So remember, I'm sorry, which drug are you talking about giving without point of care testing?
When you use the seasonal malaria chemotherapy, I'm talking about the anti-malarial drug, right? So you would just give that to...
Yeah.
Right, because that's your endpoints are malaria incidents, right, in human beings. They're not entomological endpoints, they're malaria incidents. Is that correct? That's what the major endpoint is.
That's correct, but there's no testing. It's a preventive chemotherapy. So you don't test the children, you give to all the children.
Right, okay. The second question relates to resistance. Has resistance in blood-feeding mosquitoes been demonstrated? As you know, in the veterinary literature, there's the cattle ticks. There's a lot of resistance to ivermectin. So has that been looked for before? Do you have any data on that?
So the target of ivermectin is different from any of the targets of any public health insecticide used to date. So in terms of target mutation, you wouldn't expect a problem. However, in terms of metabolism, there is opportunity for ivermectin to share some metabolic pathway in the mosquito with some insecticides. So it cannot be ruled out that mosquitoes that overexpress cytochromes, for example, could also be faster metabolizers of ivermectin itself. As far as I know, there's no evidence that you could generate. There's people who have tried, and I think Brian is over there, and Brian has tried to breed a resistant colony, and the last time we talked, he mentioned that it was very difficult because of the reduced fertility. So even if you don't kill them, if they're not able to lay eggs, it adds another stumbling block for resistance to develop. So the short answer is yes, it could be possible through metabolic pathways, but I'm not aware.
Hi. I just have a little bit of a different question. I went to the clinical group meeting this morning, and it was about environmental health. And there was a little bit of discussion on one of the presentations about and there was an image of a young girl making fuel out of cow patties. And so it made me think about, when you're talking about this volume of ivermectin being released into the environment, is anything known about the combustibles from ivermectin? Because there's going to be very high levels of this drug unchanged in the cow feces.
That's a great question. And I would say not to my knowledge, but the researcher at Virginia Tech, where I'm at, who is really sort of thinking about these things, I might bring that up to her. She does environmental chemistry and around soil science, but that would be something interesting to consider that I had not thought of.
Thank you very much. I just have an exploratory question I'd love to hear on entomological surveillance, especially the talk on the veterinary applications. I thought it was fascinating the kind of ecological arms race you could potentially set up with changing mosquito populations, and how that might really make you even change which kinds of, with limited resources, which kinds of vector control tools you would want to invest in as a part of a country's national strategic plan, and how the kind of timing and flexibility over a period of 3 years, 5 years, 7 years you might need to make, and that could only be done on the basis of entomological surveillance. So my question is, given the status of entomological surveillance in these countries, what would really be needed, do you think, to really make the best kind of resource allocation decisions between an ivermectin program together with other types of vector control strategies?
Carlos, you take this. I didn't quite understand. What did he say? So as I understood your question, it is that that beyond resistance testing and needing to understand speciation, making sure that the mosquitoes are susceptible, what kind of entomological surveillance would be needed, which is really not true just for ivermectin, but for making the decision of adding IRS. Someone the other day raised the question of how long do you sustain LLINs at very low levels. So there are a complexity of questions that feed into country decision making about what package of vector control they use, and this will just add one more nuance to them. As far as I know, there are groups working on that essential entomological surveillance information kit that countries would want to use, and it may depend by the type of interventions. It's clearly neither fleshed out nor well enough supported in many countries.
Thank you for the presentation. When I came in, my spirit was very high, and then during the presentation by the veterinarians kind of scared me, but I resisted being scared. Some years back, I read a paper from Australia where on a farm, some cattle were given ivermectin, but half of the cattle were not given on the same farm. And in the end, of course, ivermectin was in the environment, and at the end of the day, all the cattle on the farm benefited. And so at the scale you are talking about distributing ivermectin is very exciting, because it looks like if it's in the environment, it's going to do a lot of good things that we are not talking about. Kids that are not treated will have the benefits. Some other animals that don't receive ivermectin probably will receive it in a way. But my question here is, are you planning, I hope you are, to have some cost on risk benefit studies on this? Because when you hear of the environment, the environmental issues raised, they're kind of scary, but at the end of the day, when you see through the tunnel, they are also great benefits for entire population, but also on many levels, having ivermectin as a drug in the community. Thanks.
Yes, thank you for that question. I think that is, in a large part, what I had hoped to show with the diagrams up there is that when we think about sort of cost-benefit analysis or a cost-effectiveness analysis, the different ways that you can look at things and the economic benefits. That's why I really wanted to stress the idea of thinking about this from the perspective of how can we incorporate those indirect costs, those indirect benefits into our economic analysis. So oftentimes when we're looking at this, the WHO wants cost per case averted, right? Cost per case of malaria averted, which is a very important thing. It helps you to compare across other malaria intervention tools. But when we're talking about something like ivermectin that has the potential to reach livestock populations and have these indirect effects on economies and nutrition, and potentially, as you said, there's positive environmental benefit. There's the potential for positive environmental impacts as well as negative. That is part of this roadmap. We do, what we presented today were just sort of components of this, but actually we talk about that all of those things need to be incorporated in the bigger cost-benefit analysis, including this idea of environmental variation. So in some areas, the environmental impact may be very low, and it may actually be the positive impacts that we see. Whereas in others, we may say these are the environments where it actually would have real negative impact and could sway us away from using it. So, I'm glad you said what you said, because it makes me feel like you got the bigger picture, which is what I was hoping for, and to just give you some assurance that we are considering all of those in sort of a cost effectiveness analysis.
So it's about time now, but we can squeeze in one last question.
Hi, thank you for making time. So my question is, I was wondering if you've considered the effects of ivermectin on... You can't hear it.
We can't hear you.
Mm-hmm. My question has to do with considering the effects, again, the environmental impact of ivermectin, or just ivermectins in general, on aquatic life. I think I've read that they're rather toxic, and thinking about delivering ivermectin during the rainy season, there's going to be a lot of rain, which then washes away the ivermectin that's been secreted in the manure, and how that then gets into the waterways. Just wondering if that's been considered.
So I'll take that as the One Health person, but I can tell you I'm not an environmental scientist. But I do know there's some interesting things around how ivermectin actually gets sort of accumulates in the sediment, and so there's the potential that it may not be in the water, or there may be lower amounts in the water itself. But these are all things that are being considered as part of the roadmap, and I know as part of some of the studies going forward, how do you look at that? And there may be areas where that's not as big of a concern versus others, but absolutely those are things to consider.
Just an open question about aquatic environments, mosquito larvae as well.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm not going to say anything else, but this would potentially be in contact with mosquito larvae once it enters the water.
Another positive effect.
I think
potentially
the way to think about a roadmap is that you don't necessarily solve all the problems. Ideally, you identify them and lay out a roadmap and, if possible, the tools that would be used to solve them, and at what point that becomes critical. Clearly, there needs to be a public health investment case. There also needs to be an industry investment case, because of looking for manufacturers that are willing to engage at the volume that's required in a high volume, low price market. But with those conditions, then we can do that analysis, including all of the aspects that you heard here and many others that couldn't be summarized. Remember, these are 5 really smart people, and we had 35 at that last meeting, and from very different communities, and it was a very rich discussion. So we hope to be able to present the final roadmap in the coming months. It's undergoing review right now. And thank everyone for your engagement, and keep your ears open as you see the data emerging from the trials, which will be the next part that starts coming forth in the next couple of years. Thank you very much.
Thank you.